Muito bom dia, com muita alegria que saúdo todos os presentes e os ausentes fisicamente deste espaço, mas que nos acompanham através da internet. Saúdo também e manifesto a vontade de que mesmo as pessoas que não estão aqui possam participar através das plataformas digitais que eventualmente sejam vistas aqui por alguém que está na sala. Eu gostava de, muito rapidamente, introduzir a conferência de abertura da professora Kathleen Tyner, dizendo que é uma professora da Universidade do Texas, em Austin, nos Estados Unidos, onde leciona no Departamento de Rádio, Televisão e Cinema. É uma das maiores especialistas dos Estados Unidos e internacional na área da Media and Information Literacy, trabalhando nomeadamente sobre os novos média, as crianças e os média comunitários, jogos educativos, os chamados jogos sérios, os mundos virtuais, enfim, há aqui uma panóplia enorme de aspectos, não é? Mas talvez eu destacasse, não sei se é uma leitura adequada, mas destacasse a importância dos jogos e da usabilidade para os novos média, que estes dois aspectos, a importância que têm no seu contributo que têm dado. Já agora mencionar dois trabalhos importantes da professora Kathleen Tyner, nomeadamente Visions and Revisions, Moving Forward with Media Education. É um trabalho que foi feito com Barry Duncan, do Canadá, creio eu. E, mais recentemente, Media Literacy, New Agendas in Communication. Eu gostava, no entanto, de fazer uma nota pessoal daquilo que conheço mal, e estou ansioso também por aprender com o contributo que ela nos vai dar, mas daquilo que eu fui conhecendo e acompanhando da professora Kathleen Tyner, eu destacaria dois aspectos. Um foi algo que me diz bastante, porque fiz também uma trajetória parecida, que foi começar como profissional dos média, nomeadamente no jornalismo, na produção, e começar a querer partilhar com outros as aprendizagens que nós fazemos enquanto profissionais e envolvendo gente da audiência, digamos, partilhando para um público mais vasto estas digamos, competências que nós vamos adquirindo como profissionais. Acho que essa interação, essa troca é fundamental. E a outra é o papel que ela introduz pela sua formação e pelos seus interesses, o papel que ela atribui à arte e digamos assim, à expressão artística, às linguagens da arte, sobretudo num tempo em que nos nossos sistemas de ensino esta componente tem vindo a ser, em muitos contextos, e nomeadamente em Portugal, tão esvaziada do meu ponto de vista. E, aliás, do ponto de vista da professora Kathleen Tyner. Mas a palavra é dela. Ela hoje vai-nos falar sobre a educação para os média nos Estados Unidos, a próxima geração. Vamos ver o que é essa próxima geração. E thank you for coming and to share with us your visions and your experiences. I hope we can benefit for your contribution. Thank you. Não tem o som.
Thank you. I'm privileged to be here, and I want to thank the sponsors for this opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to talk. It's grandiose to think that I can speak for the whole United States and Canada, but I will do my best here today. We have a very complex subject, and as you very well know, this is intertwined. Literacy and education have been intertwined since the printing press. And so what I want to do is talk about changes in literacy tools and texts, but I also want to talk about changes in education as we approach this subject. Okay, so let's just do a little history for North America here. North America tried various approaches to integrate new media and media literacy into the formal school curriculum. And most of the focus was on formal schooling for the term media literacy. So a number of national advocacy groups like the National Association for Media Literacy Education, the Center for Media Literacy, and others, in Wisconsin, the National Telemedia Council. You have seen this in other countries where people come together as advocacy groups and try to push this in various ways, not only, mostly for policy and for funding streams and so on. One of the main things that people did at conferences such as this in North America was to define and redefine media literacy and to try to come up with some guiding principles or key concepts. Now, the first of these came out of Canada, the Association for Media Literacy in Canada, and they were heavily influenced by Lynn Masterman and David Buckingham and Livingstone from the UK. These were then taken again more recently in the United States and redone again. And you know it's the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and produce. And it's reiterated many, many times with many definitions. I think the one that is drawing the most consensus is the term from UNESCO, the digital and media literacy terms from UNESCO. And there's simple definitions. But I hope that we're beginning to move past that because it's a very complex issue and I don't think we're going to define it anytime soon. There's always been issues about how much media analysis or critical literacy and how much media production or critical production. And when we look at this from the perspective of formal educators, oftentimes they do not have the production experience from their pre-service education as teachers, from their mentorship. So we see really passionate and talented teachers come into the schooling and they start a program in production and that program gets established. But if that individual teacher moves on, oftentimes there's no one to take the place. So the idea about production, and I'm talking about North America and what I've seen there, the idea about production, people want to do that. Oftentimes it's tool literacy where they're taught keyboarding or how to use Microsoft Word, but there's more creative production also. It's tied to single individuals. If the school is lucky enough to have several of those individuals, a program can be rooted. If not, it's very transient sometimes. Again, the education, it's on the formal education or schooling. In the U.S., schooling is still free. Public schooling is still free, but increasingly we have partners from the corporate sector who have a lot of roles for the funding for schooling. Standards and disciplines, media educators in North America in the last century really wanted to create their own discipline. And they did this in two ways. They tried to get media literacy as a core subject in each discipline, usually the English language arts or the social studies and history. And in addition to technology education, where a lot of the critical literacy or analysis component was left behind. And one good way to do this was to integrate it into standards. So you know that the standards education movement or standards-driven education in the 1990s, it was started in the US by the first George Bush, and it was called No Child Left Behind, and it was tied to a lot of assessment. Originally, it was promised that these standards would be created by local educators. In the end, the standards were increasingly created at the national level. Now, this is different from many countries, I think, and Canada works similarly by province. The states and the provinces have a lot of control over standards and over what happens in their educational curriculum. Increasingly, it's gone more and more and more national, and we'll talk about the problems with that in a minute. So, in order to meet these standards, there was a rationale for teacher professional development. And so over the years, a lot of the curriculum was directed not at the students particularly, although sometimes, but often at their teachers, and to try to get the teachers up to speed on new media and technology. These various model curriculum were created as models, but also sometimes they were guidance for both teachers and students. And there are very, very many theoretical arguments about the aims and purposes for this. A lot of it was still rooted in broadcast media, even though the internet was coming on strong at the end of the 20th century. And some was protectionist and about responsibility and protection. Some was creative. And again, we come at these tensions as we go along. So let me talk a little bit about chalk and cheese, which is the UK expression for things that do not fit together well. I call them affordances and constraints. And like all literacy, we have great benefit and we also have challenges for all aspects of literacy because it's about human communication and it's a difficult subject. One of these things is as the formal education sector was beginning to understand media literacy, the informal education sector had been doing this for a long time, but the informal education center had many, many differences in their approach and their aims and purposes. One of the major things was to represent communities who did not feel they had a voice in society, so they could go to the local cable station or the local radio station or create a local newspaper to try to get their voice out and about issues that were important to them, usually on a more local level. It had a lot to do with civic activism and collaboration within communities and community building. It was often had a social justice focus. And so these local community media centers are very big across both the United States and in Canada too, and often depend on nonprofit funding, sometimes government funding through various government agencies like the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Endowment for the Humanities. But a lot of this had to do also with access. And to this day, even though there's huge access, very wide access in the United States, to this day, many communities, especially in rural areas, do not have access that we think is normal in urban centers. So when they collect together, maybe one person in a household has a game box, or one person has, a lot of people have cell phones, but the access is not always good at schools and so on, to this day. And so these community centers, maybe they're at libraries or so on, and they help this. One of the things I want to say about this, in the early days, I give you guerrilla television. This was by a man named Michael Schomburg. And Michael Schomburg believed that he wanted to do experimental media to see what these video cameras could do. And there was a lot of tension around this playing with the arts versus having a message. So the tension in this informal media education sector has to do with, do we have a social justice message, or can we just, for our own personal pleasure, play around with these media? Michael Schomburg went on to do storytelling in media with Pulp Fiction and other kinds of, he's a great Hollywood filmmaker in the traditional sense. But his idea of playing with the media is very much like artistic practice, where you have studio artists who are doing their own thing, and then you have people who come together in collectives for other purposes, to use their artistic expression for other purposes. So this is a small but very interesting tension. The other problem with informal media education sectors is the funding, and it's not just the funding, it's also strategic planning around sustainability. But there are so many people who want to take advantage of their services, and there's so little funding that it's a capacity issue. And by capacity, I mean the ability to serve their audiences, or the people who want to take advantage of their services. Now, one of the solutions for that is to partner with formal educators in public schooling, And this has been done with a number of programs. Educational Video Center in New York City is one of the more interesting ones, but across the US and Canada, there are partnerships between informal educators who often have the artistic and technical skills that are not found in the public education sector. But here's another problem with that. The cultures of those two do not always match. So it's sort of relegated to after-school programming, summer camps, and so on. This is a good thing. Also, the more the formal education sector takes on the idea of teaching media arts and media education, the more it drains the capacity of the informal educators. So this is kind of an interesting dilemma, but in order for both to survive and support very strong media education programs, these strategic partnerships are vital. Now, I call all of this, the way that media education has been practiced in many schools, I call it the tyranny of the narrative. And I've written a lot about that. And because teachers in particular and administrators feel very comfortable with storytelling. They feel very comfortable with media as a way to tell stories. Instead of actually looking at media practices and systems and aesthetics, oftentimes they focus on the characters, the narrative arc, and so on, because that's the comfort zone. Unfortunately, when we talk especially about cinema, but other things, it's not about the story only. It's about the aesthetics, it's about the editing, it's about the limitations of each medium that you use, and as we go to mobile, for webisodes and other things, we see more and more how these aesthetics influence the media that we receive and the way that we create meaning from it. So I want to say that the arts are extremely important to this subject. And without the arts, and I'm talking about aesthetics in a non-narrative way, it's very difficult to understand fully the meaning and the critical literacy skills needed to understand film, cinema, and other kinds of media. Okay, I won't dwell on this too long, but I was trying to explain media literacy or literacy to my students. And so I decided that the best way to explain that was in the form of a mandala, because it's a representation of the universe, which of course you cannot represent. And in this case, the universe is literacy, and the big part of this has to do with the content of literacy and the context of literacy. So I put the content in the middle, and everybody argued with me. So I created a blank one online, and if you want to go to the Media Literacy Mandala online, you can create your own mandala, which I encourage you to do. But for today's conversation, I want to talk about how it is not enough to be critically literate to focus on content and to deconstruct content all day long. Not only the narratives, but the shot composition and the editing and the montage. It's not enough. You can't be fully literate without understanding the context within which this media is received. And sometimes I think we forget about this as we try to plan for the future of media education and its integration into learning. So by context, I mean the social, cultural, political, historical, economic, and environmental factors. And by environmental, I mean the setting in this world, or a virtual world, the setting in which it's received, and the way we see it, and where we're sitting, and the lighting, and the community. So let's just keep that in mind, that I'm going to approach this from a contextual issue. And because I'm talking about North America, I have to talk about Marshall McLuhan. And McLuhan was prescient, as usual, when he says the medium is the message, and perhaps we should evaluate media in terms of its interface rather than its content. So there's another tension there, an age-old tension in literacy between form and content. Whether it's font and typeface or the constraints of a mobile phone, it affects the way we interpret this communication. So today, just for a few minutes in the short time we have, I want to engage in a little systems thinking. And I hope that the things that I learn here will help me to understand something more about the way these communication devices and systems are working in the real world. McLuhan sort of, again, intimated that by studying the form, we are also studying things like business models. We're studying things about the way these communication devices have rocked the world. And it's a little bit more than just devices. I mean, for example, visuals now, at least with my students, I had this conversation about how students don't read like they used to read. They still read. But oftentimes when they express themselves, it's through visuals and visual imagery. And so the role of visual literacy is very interesting. It's very psychological. It's very idiosyncratic and arbitrary, and a little bit hard to talk about the meaning that visuals create. In this case, I'm just showing some devices over the years. These devices from oral literacies through visual literacies, through audio, through all of these various multi-literacies that we experience and communicate in the world. But my point with systems thinking is that one thing does lead to another. For example, see if I can get this. I don't want to point it at anybody's eyes. Okay. For example, if you look at the top here, the railroad in North America gave way to some systems of roads that were used by cars, and now we use the invention of the car as part of industrial farming with all the problems of industrial farming. And as we come to a global village, without these infrastructures, these things don't happen. This is culturally based. And I think we take these things for granted and don't think about it. So before we start to talk about communication devices, I want to talk about other ways that systems work to shake the world. For example, the refrigerator. We take the refrigerator for granted. But when the refrigerator first came out, it wasn't necessarily accepted by everybody. They said, why should we get fresh meat every day at the butcher? Why should we have a refrigerator? Why do we want to keep the meat in there for a day, you know? But now we just take it for granted that the refrigerator is the way it is. The same with the electrical light bulb. Without the electrical light bulb, we wouldn't have cinema, without the invention of the camera. And this is interesting. Okay, this thing here is called a sensorama. This was one of the first virtual reality devices made in 1957 by this man named Morton Halig in Los Angeles. They found 2 of them in warehouses in Los Angeles. And not only do you put your head in there and you see things and hear things, but also there's this smell that comes out. So it's kind of a crazy device, but people continue to try to get out of themselves, whether they read a novel and lose themselves in that virtual world, or whether they go into Second Life, or whether now we have Google glasses, which give us alternative worlds. And so it's almost like, quantum physics or something. But all of these things have ramifications on other structures in the real world. And this is one of the things that I think we have not taught or thought about enough when we teach about media education. The context of these systems and the way these systems change and shape social behavior have to do with a lot of the things that we've held dear for many years. Over here, I have the computer. Whoops. Okay. So this is from Lowell, Massachusetts, where they had this huge factory to make garments. This is not a computer. This is from the garment industry. And I'm sure that most of you know that the garment industry and those kinds of machines created the first computers. This is Charles Babbage's first computer at the university, or in a museum of London. And it's based on this machine that made clothing in the Industrial Revolution. We go down here, and then we have to have all these infrastructures of various things for broadcast, for mobile phones, for computers. And now we can get access, even in the most rural areas, it is possible to get access. So all of these systems have come together, and down here in this corner, we see a sea of data. This man is floating in a sea of data. Now, what do we do about this? And how does this shape our systems and our economic systems and our personal behavior? So this is all part of media education, and to show you the complexity of it, in Austin, Texas, there's an organization called the New Media Consortium. Every year they do a Horizon report. They do it for higher ed, for elementary education, for secondary education. And what they do is they bring together what's called a Delphi group of experts. And they come together in almost like a focus group to figure out trends in devices, but also trends in the uses of communication devices. So here is how it impacts education. Their latest report, this is for higher ed, they think that people want to work, learn, and study whenever and wherever they want. They think that technology is increasingly are cloud-based, and we don't really need these devices so much, or we don't need the huge storage for these devices. Don't get me started on the infrastructure for large server farms. All right, the work is increasingly collaborative, it's challenge-based, it's active. Our students come and they expect this. The workplace expects this. I know people who work for IBM. They work in a group based out of Silicon Valley, but somebody might be in Barcelona, somebody might be in Mexico City, somebody might be in the United States, and they're all working on the same projects. All right, increasingly, I don't know if you're getting the pressure for online, but in the United States and Canada, we're getting pressure to do more and more online classes for a number of reasons, both good and bad. And also this idea that the expertise can be Googled, or we can look at Wikipedia, does challenge the role of educators in a way that we're only beginning to respond to this challenge. So this is what the Horizon report came with, and I will leave some references behind here so that you can look at these things more closely at your leisure. But as in all things literacy, there are affordances and constraints to this. All right, suddenly in the United States, I don't know about Europe so much, but we have a lot of pressure. The textbook companies are shaping our textbooks for our students, and increasingly our online courses and those online resources. There's a lot of competition, especially for standardized testing, for private schooling, for other kind of charter schooling. So it's shaking up the educational system as we think about it as free public education, as a way to consolidate civic participation. All right, peer review models. There's a lot of pressure around tenure. And these peer reviewed journals, as you know, are linked to tenure or the tenure process. So peer-reviewed journals, I think all over the world really, are struggling. And this different kind of peer review bumps up against open source. So there's a little confusion there about the traditional role of peer-reviewed journals. But more than that, a lot of the research coming out about media literacy and the uses of media in society are coming out of nonprofit think tanks or for-profit proprietary information where perhaps they will release the results to us, but we do not see the methodology and sampling and the things we need to see to validate the surveys or the studies. So you see this increasingly. They're often reported in journalism. Oftentimes they're very, very good studies. So Pew Charitable Trust has great studies. The MacArthur Foundation has great studies. None of these are necessarily scholarly organizations, and many scholars are going to these think tanks, or Dell Computers has, and Microsoft has scholars. So this is kind of interesting to take this role of scholarship outside the academy into other realms. Digital media literacy, even though everybody, I think, has a consensus that we need to learn this, the report says that it's very rarely done, especially in a formal way in teacher professional development. And there are a lot of institutional barriers to all of this change, of course, because it shakes the whole foundations of everything for better or for worse. Also, I think it's important to talk about the curatorial roles, gatekeeping, we call it too, the keeper of the gate, for the role of libraries and other kinds of places where this information is archived and stored. So, here's a quote about the digital media literacy, and again, it's just mostly says that it is not done as we would like for it to be done in university faculty programs for teacher ed, even though we agree on it. Now, organizations of teachers have embraced this. This is the National Council of Teachers of English, and this is their diagram for 21st century literacy. Again, we try to lay out the aims and purposes. So one of them is life and career skills, and again, information, media, and technology skills. Very simple. But the arguments in North America sort of boil down to these points. And as the recession came on strong, workforce development went up as a purpose for this, which means that it privileges somewhat the technical skills that are supposedly available in the workforce. But they've brought them into this architecture or built space that is somewhat out of step with the technical workforce for software development and that sort of 21st century skills. Also, the need for social capital around social networks and what that means and what people are willing to sacrifice in order to gain social capital in social networks. Civic participation is still huge, but the role of new media like Twitter and Facebook in civic participation is still debatable. Does it follow protest and action and civic participation? Or is it like a clickable where you're sort of aware and you click like on Facebook and that's your participation? So I think that's still debatable. To give people a voice and to allow them to manage their own information is a really important issue for media literacy, as well as personal expression and simple relaxation and entertainment. So let's just, for a quick example, let's just talk a little bit about the workforce development. Here's an old office from a movie called The Apartment in the 1960s. And this is the workplace from the past. But I live in San Francisco part of the year, and I see these technical professionals gather at coffee houses. One in my neighborhood is called Revolution, and it's all these hipsters, and they come to the coffee house, and they plug in, and they work. And in the past, if you worked for a corporation, you would never share the information that you're working on. But I watch them, and they share across companies. And if they have a problem, they ask a colleague if they have a problem with the coding or something like that. This is the new workplace. And if you go to Silicon Valley, a lot of places like Google are set up like this, like these cafes. It's interesting. A man named Jaron Lanier was one of the pioneers of the internet, and I really recommend his book, Who Owns the Future, for those of you interested in this. So he says that he takes up this issue of economic development and new media. And I think this is something important as we talk about the aims and purposes of media education. And what he says is that we are creating all the wealth for a very few people who own the servers. Those of you who participate in Facebook know that when you sign the agreement for Facebook, that Facebook owns your material. They aggregate the material. They direct ads back to you. They sell your material. And I don't think, my students are aware of this, and it's the price that they pay to have the social capital. But he talks about how this is actually shifting and creating pressures on the middle class who do not get paid, and in particular artists like musicians. Now I know we have Spotify and Pandora and everything, but they don't have a funding stream like they did in the past. So yes, they can go perform at a bar or whatever, but even though they wrote and own this material, as it goes out, a lot of people are taking revenue from it. So it makes it harder and harder to make a living as an artist. So these are the kind of things I think that are important to make our students aware of. And in terms of responsibility, if they make the choice to go ahead and do this, to do it in their own way. Now also this issue of, I call this tag wrangling. Now wrangling is a Texas word that has to do with cows, sort of like bullfighting and rodeo. And so those who make the information available through tagging have a lot of power. So you can be a clicker and you can click through the information, find what you can find. But if you can tag that information for people to find, this is a skill that is really, really important for media education. And it's like these old businesses like Kodak. 2 years ago in San Francisco, I went around and processed the last batch of 16 millimeter film that I had in the refrigerator. Because there's nobody else to process it now. And Kodak, they're practically bankrupt, but Instagram is trending. So we become more clickers, less clickers of cameras and more clickers online, actually. But if we can make our stuff available through tag wrangling, then we have a little more power with our literacy. Also, where does coding lie? We talk about reading and writing. I mean, if we want to produce media in this age, we have to know how to code. If you want to produce mobile media, we have to know how to do JavaScript as well as HTML5. Now, my students are learning this on their own in those cafes or together. And increasingly, in the last 8 years I've been in Texas, I've seen the students come in knowing more and more coding. And they're self-taught and they're learning it from peers. It's very interesting to me. And they don't want to be computer scientists. They want to be filmmakers. But they know that they have to get themselves out there, so they want to produce this stuff. And so where does coding lie in our vision for media education? And furthermore, how are we going to deal with this issue of big data? Now, big data is not a great word, but we're swimming in a sea of data, and as Dana Boyd and others have written about, this data is used then to aggregate and to direct for advertising, for sales. If I have a fancy computer, I'll get a different ad than a person who has a cheap computer. It's very interesting, but we can't see the methodology, the sampling, and furthermore, relationships are established between big data, and they don't always make sense, but it's so complicated. So I have to say, where do research skills come into media literacy education? I want my students to be able to see if the sample is valid. I want them to understand what that means, and at least understand polling data and other kinds of data that are increasingly used for public opinion and writing. And it relates very well to production through data visualization. So not only to talk about research results and studies, but also to visualize it in a way that makes it concise and focused. My students have a lot of fun doing infographics or data visualizations. And many universities have started to establish labs where you can study all the cadence and metrics of Shakespeare and make a data visualization about it. Or the beat poets, where you can actually go down and study Legos with kids to see which moves they make best so that you can use that information for robotics programs and other things like that. So this is interesting. The data visualization is interesting, and it doesn't have to be computerized. It can be hand-drawn. But also, I talk to my students a lot about managing the digital afterlife. Now, the digital afterlife is an interesting term by Elizabeth Soep, who works at Youth Radio in Oakland, California. Youth Radio is huge. It's in the middle of Oakland, and kids from all over the city come and make radio programming that is often shown on national networks like National Public Radio. So she calls it the digital afterlife because they did this story about sex trafficking, and it was used throughout the internet in a way that they did not intend. It was done by kids, and they were horrified by the way it went viral on the internet. So this was an issue. This was an issue of Comunicar Revista, if you can see that online. Anyway, but what it means is once it gets out there, you don't have control of it. So my students on Facebook, they're putting their pictures up there. They're starting to get the idea that these have a digital afterlife that they must manage if they want to get a job after their undergraduate program. So new rules, we're almost there. I just met with a bunch of Canadians at the Ontario Institute for the Study of Education at the University of Toronto. These included people who work on UNESCO programs like Caroline Wilson, people like Neil and all the colleagues of Barry Duncan and people that you may know from Canada. They have, we came to this idea that we keep trying to work at a national level, and this is a really good idea and very, very important. But at this point, it's time to go local again and figure out how schools can customize this so that it fits in this very unstable age of these infrastructures that are changing so rapidly. So they decided that instead of working on state standards, they were going to also go to local school districts and local schools and see what kind of programs were there, and to just go more local. And I think it's a good idea. We call it the end of the beginning of media education. And what that means is we want to respond to this new context, and we want to mentor a whole new generation of educators who can respond to this new context in a way that sustains media education and its integration. So all of these things, including interdisciplinary multiliteracies, including design curriculum, where we're thinking about pedagogy around active project-based work, including strategic partnerships between informal and formal spaces and others, and including infrastructure and access. Now, one of the major problems we have is with school buildings, what we call the built world. These school buildings are not set up for project-based work and active learning. We're not going to get new school buildings anytime soon, even the furniture. It's not mobile. It's not easy to deal with. And you see in these schools where their active learning is taking place, kids sit out in the hall. They try to find a space with light and where they can talk and not make too much. It's a problem. But that's one of the things of interest to deal with. So I want to just show you a few things around these issues. So around the local issue, there's something called Tech Shop. This is for adults, but they're starting to do a children's program. It started in a warehouse in San Francisco, and they bought all these expensive equipment like 3D printing, like other things that people couldn't afford on their own. And it created more of a communal situation where people have a membership and they can go use the equipment. They have sewing machines if you want to do high-end fashion. And if you want to hire somebody to come and help you to learn to use the machine better, you can do that. So this is kind of an interesting model, and it is so social. And people are collaborating and learning together and participating. It's starting to spread across the United States. They have branches in about 5 places now. And I think it's an interesting model. I think that you've probably seen these with computer labs too, that are social spaces where people learn computing. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about, interdisciplinary education, people are starting to talk about STEAM. Now, the focus, especially in the recession, on science, technology, engineering, and math has been very, very strong throughout the world, and it's important for workforce development. But people are coming in saying, without innovation and creativity provided by the arts, you really can't move forward. So instead of STEM, they're calling it STEAM, to put the arts in there. And they even started a STEAM journal recently. It just launched. So if you want to look at people's ideas for putting the arts into engineering and science and technology and math, take a look at the STEAM journal. The other thing that we want to deal with is this notion of interactivity and gatekeeping. We have the old model where the information went through a lot of vetting, and then the broadcast model where it was funneled to the audiences. But YouTube just, I think this week, came up with channels of its own where any individual user can have his or her own channel. So that's kind of interesting. And finally, I wanted to show you this program. It's called Quest to Learn from the Institute of Play. A woman named Katie Salen founded this in New York City. It's called the Game School. And it's a public school. It started in sort of upper elementary and middle school. And people think it's about gaming, but it's actually about problem solving and collaboration and project-based work. It's a very interesting program, and it's starting to spread. They just have another one in Chicago now. So look this up and see what you think. But this is about interdisciplinary education. It's about a lot of things that have to do with gaming strategy, chance, game mechanics, but also have to do with the use of play and so on. So I look forward to talking with you more today, and I look forward to learning more from the other presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen Tyner. De certeza que muitos de nós gostaríamos de ser alunos da professora Kathleen Tyner, não é? Depois desta comunicação. Quem sabe? De qualquer maneira, nós estamos hoje aqui, estamos a ficar um bocadinho apertados com o tempo, não é? Nós vamos ter 3 momentos, 3 quadros, por assim dizer, do panorama internacional. Este foi um primeiro sobre a América do Norte e vamos ter ainda mais 2, um em torno, digamos assim, da perspectiva da Unesco e também o caso francês, num momento muito importante deste caso do Clémy. E vamos ter, ao longo desta conferência, mais outros momentos, outras intervenções que nos ajudarão a alargar estes horizontes. Por outro lado, vamos ter os conferencistas connosco e, ao longo destes dias, podemos interagir com eles, eventualmente colocar-lhes questões, estabelecer redes, etc. Estas conferências têm este papel. A não ser que haja alguma questão assim imediata que não possa ser conversada no intervalo também com a professora Kathleen Tyner. Aqui uma. Então eu pediria que interviesse, está aqui à frente, procurando ser rápido, porque vamos tentar ganhar tempo.
Very quickly, there was a lot of interesting points. I'd like to point just to outline one. You talk about informal literacy. As myself, I'm studying as well informal literacy connected with the local public opinion. You're listening? Yeah. Informal literacy connected with local public opinion at museums and public art reception. Do you hear me? Thank you. Yeah. Right. Okay. I'll try to be brief. You talk a lot about a lot of interesting points, but I'll underline the informal education. As I'm studying as well, informal education and connected with local public opinion at art museums and public art reception. So You talked about as well about accountability, which is a very interesting idea, but unfortunately you had no time to develop it. Usually accountability is a way of justifying the politician discourse about their politics and their policies and politics. And my question is straight this one. You talk about as well about mashups. And my question is, how can we manage that the owners of new media, and especially those who do mashups, can be accountable by public opinion, local public opinion, to give a voice to citizens? Because maybe in these two directions, citizens can have informal literacy and local public opinion to make the politicians' action accountable. Yeah.
Very quickly, you're talking, I think, there is a lot happening in museum education. I worked with the Miami Science and Museum, for example, to do a virtual world to teach climate science, where the kids produced objects in Maya software, and a lot of this is funded by the government. In the States, it's interesting because the funding also comes from private and foundation sectors, I think more than in Europe perhaps. But in either case, it is important, I think, to do evaluation about the impact of your program. And I don't think that's a punitive thing. If it doesn't turn out well, we call it lessons learned. And it allows you to correct the program, and it allows the funding to go to places that are more likely to be sustainable. Without these, what I'll call them test beds, without these field-tested programs and without this evaluation of these field-tested programs, we cannot really move forward in a sustainable way. So it's just like, just to fund all these things is not what I mean by the shortage of funding. It's strategic funding, and we do that best through impact evaluation, which you know, that's also a trend everywhere. And it's about accountability, but if we do it to, like, based on very hardcore scientific, formal gold standard research, we're liable to cauterize the messy innovation that happens through experimentation. So it's sort of a tension between experimentation and does it work? And is my tax dollar well spent? So hopefully, the politicians won't understand this, but the policymakers often do. The bureaucrats often understand this, that we have a little mess with innovation, and we correct it, but we can only find that out with some really solid evaluation. So we didn't have time to talk about this, but there is not enough research and evaluation about our subject area to help to support and guide the things that we plan and do. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Thank you very much. We have now, vamos ter agora pequeno intervalo, 5 a 10 minutos, e regressamos aqui para continuar. E muito obrigado à professora Kathleen Tyner.